as well in the Sky Room. And many of you, I migrated here from California, the Bay Area, and you may not know how refreshing the airwaves are in Colorado, including the public airwaves. You got two competing public television stations, one of them carrying Amy Goodman over the air. You have an AM signal, an FM signal. You have a wonderful thing. So I don't know what to say about Maeve Conran. She's now the news director. She's been at KGNU how many years?
About 10.
It's going on, you're going into your second decade. My goodness. Well, KGNU deserves all the support we could get. And she'll be the moderator introducing our panelists. I want to say normally we pass the hat here at the forum, but we're foregoing that. And we have a little sign that says donations and go and see this people because they really need to keep their voice going. And they have a table in the Sky Room and they really want to hear, get your name, and if you can make a donation, that would be very helpful. So what are we going to do tonight? Maeve's going to introduce the people. We're going to go for about a half an hour or more or less, and then go to about 8:30. That's in about 75 minutes from now. We'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion here. That's what Susan and Mike and the gang want to do. And then we're going to adjourn to the Sky Room where we have a reception and refreshments for everybody. So you got the mic, kid.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the kind words, Henry, and thanks to everyone for supporting KGNU. We just had a great pledge drive recently, but I won't talk too much. I'm really excited to have a terrific panel here, I think representing the best of journalism that we have here in Colorado. And for those of you who were just heartbroken when Mike Litwin's columns were no longer available on Sundays. What the hell am I going to do on a Sunday? I can't read Mike. We're just delighted with himself and Susan Green, who also, I was very upset when her columns were no longer available to me in the Denver Post. Well, they have both together founded the Colorado Independent, an independent online news source. And so we're going to hear more about that. And we're delighted to have two of their reporters here as well, Tessa Cheek and John Tomasic. And as I said, I don't want to talk too much. So I'm going to let Susan talk a little bit about the Colorado Independent. And we're going to get into the midterm elections, but also some of the other terrific reports that they're doing, particularly in the realm of investigative journalism, which, as we're going to hear, is, you know, in dire straits because of the current model of funding media, and what's happening at the Colorado Independent is so critical. So, Susan.
Hi. We just want to thank you all before we start. It's so nice to come this far and have so many friendly faces in the audience, especially on a cold, dark Sunday night. So thank you all for being here. And I just want to recognize Henry. For those of you who are part of this community and this congregation, you have a jewel in that man. He is as ardent a friend to Colorado, to independent media as you can get, and a terrific reader, and we're just happy to know him. We were thrilled to be invited here, so thank you. And then Maeve, of course, the goddess. I think I may have just turned this off.
Oh, that's fine.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here too. And we kind of have a new little thing going on with Maeve, because we now have an office in Denver Open Media, which has a KGNU little satellite. So we're now kind of talking.
Well, and we've been very excited to have had Susan and Mike on, particularly in the run-up to the midterm elections, but also to have had Susan and Mike on Democracy Now! Being broadcast nationally and internationally, talking about what's happening in Colorado, but also some of the other investigative work you're doing.
So we're going to go really quickly through who we are and where we came from before we get to the election. We actually did not found the Colorado Independent. It was founded in 2007-ish by an organization, 2006, by an organization out of Washington, D.C. called, it wasn't really called this, but it ended up...
The Center for Independent Media. Center for Independent Media originally, now it's then it became the American Independent News Network, and now it's defunct.
No. Now it's called the American Independent the American Independent Institute. It's not totally defunct. And what happened is they had these, because they're our fiscal sponsor, so they're not totally defunct. And
Not defunct.
yeah, so say that again.
The news part is it's not defunct.
So they had these, recognizing that things were going south in mainstream media, they developed independent news sites in states, lots of states around the country. And that was kind of at the dawn of independent online media. And they struggled, and basically they all went under, except for us. We were the last people standing, thanks to a lot of support in Colorado for the kind of stuff that we do. And I was hired in January of 2013 to come on board. John is our veteran. He's been on forever. He was the editor. He's been everything. He's everything. And shortly after we died. We were put to death, sleep, and we lost our jobs in March of 2013. And so what happened is we formed a corporation here in Colorado, a nonprofit corporation, and begged the funders to keep funding us and to take a chance on us, and committed to reinventing a site that had some great successes over the years, but had gone through lots of generations and different incarnations with different missions. And we have very much redefined that mission. We can talk more about that in a bit. But so we are going on we're like in our second year. This is our 1.5 year. We took this site and we just killed it and rebuilt a whole new site with a whole new look and a whole new staff. And that started the day of the recall elections in September 2013. And so we've been up since then, and it feels like forever, but it's really not been that long. And we're thrilled to be here and to have jobs. We have a lot of people working with us some of us are refugees from mainstream media, and we have a lot of people we work with who are refugees as well. And all of us feel so lucky to be doing what we're doing. So that's where we came from and where we are.
I'm John Tomasic, and like Susan says, I've been at the Colorado Independent now for 5 years, which in internet years is like 20. And just the story of I came to the Colorado Independent from another website, and then the Huffington Post, and before that, monthly magazines, and before that, academic publishing. So it was like, I was in a field where we published something once a year, and then it was once a month, and then it was once a week, and then it was 20 times a day. So I just feel like, what a wild ride. And just the Colorado Independent itself has gone through so many iterations that I feel like if I wrote the history of the Colorado Independent just from the time I've been here, it would be a history of the digital era, and it was so fly by night. And now I see that Susan and Mike is here, and this is the direction that everything's going if anything's going to survive and be of quality. So it's been a remarkable ride. I'm really happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Tessa Cheek. I'm the cub. And I came to the Colorado Independent just before we relaunched, and it was my first sort of official job in journalism. And I guess as a young person in this industry, it's an industry that people tell you not to enter because there are no jobs. And as a young person in this industry, I feel really, really lucky and really thrilled to be here. I think I'm given, I think it allows for a kind of formal freedom. I get to write big features, I get to write daily pieces, and Also ask, what is journalism, and how can we write it better? Who is it written for? And I think, being here, we're growing our readership all the time. That's a big goal for us. And there's a sort of inherent politics to that. And I reported on the state legislature last year and spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out how I could cover the only legislation in America that's happening is happening at the state level. And so I think it's time for really accessible, hyper-local news. And so I'm really thrilled to be coming up at this moment with these folks. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mike Litwin. I'm now a columnist, I understand, for the Boulder Daily Camera, which I'm very excited about. I'm now a columnist. I think have been or am a columnist in every paper in Colorado. So I'm all Colorado all the time. I came here to work for the Rocky Mountain News in 1997. I worked there until it folded. I then went to work for the Denver Post, and I stayed there until it basically folded. And now I work for the Colorado Independent, and my column appears in Pueblo and Colorado Springs and Boulder and Aspen and Craig and Greeley. It's the coolest thing. So we at the Independent we're here telling you about how tough independent media is and how how we desperately need money. But I tell you, we're having a hell of a good time. And we've been doing this together, all of us, for just over a year. And it's the election season, which may have been disastrous in many ways, was great for journalism at the Colorado Independent, because the journalism elsewhere was so wanting. So I felt like we got to do something that was really necessary, and for me, as a longtime political junkie and who's been writing political columns for 70 or 80 years, it was great entertainment, and look forward to taking your questions tonight.
Well, maybe Mike, I expand on what you were saying there about the elections and how woefully it was covered in mainstream media. I mean, what are your thoughts on the coverage in general on the elections? I mean, never mind the television ads that did nothing to educate anybody on anything, but also just maybe in the in the broadsheets in the Denver Post and some of the other regional papers. What are your thoughts on how they covered the election?
Well, they're facing a very difficult time in their defense. When the Rocky Mountain News folded, the Rocky Mountain News had about 215 people who worked in the greater editorial section. That would include copy editors and photographers and everybody that puts out the hands-on in the newspaper. And the Denver Post had about the same amount. So together they had close to 450 people, and today the Denver Post has under 150. So there were once 450 covering Denver and the suburbs and greater Colorado, and now there are 150. So that's easy math, 1/3, and so that puts everybody in a very difficult position. If you try to cover everything, you don't cover anything well. If you try to cover just a few things, you miss a lot of things you're not covering at all. So where Tessa every day, and to her, we thank her every day for being at the legislature, and it's where it used to be a crowded press room. It's now you can barely find anybody there. So that means that people aren't covering the issues as well. They're not watchdogging. Nobody is watchdogging. Just the state agencies, just as one example. So if you look at the election, you saw an extremely undercovered election, which just 4 years ago was covered much differently. 8 years ago, much differently, where many more people were involved, where each of the candidates had people tailing them, and you've seen the candidates respond as the press has plays less of a role and the TV commercials play more of a role. They avoid the press. So in the main candidates, particularly in the two big races, the four main candidates, they basically want to stay away from the press as much as possible, answer as few questions as possible, and just allow the TV ads to set the agenda. And it made it very difficult. It makes it very difficult for the media, mainstream, independent, or otherwise, to change the conversation in any important way. So that's what you saw this time. To me, it was a terrible election as far as the issues were concerned. Nobody talked really about a lot of the important issues that face the nation in a senatorial race, in a House race, face Colorado in a gubernatorial race, because it's not in their interest to do that. It's in their interest to let the TV ads, 30-second sound bites, speak for them. It's in the people's interest, of course, to have them respond to your questions and to our questions, and they didn't have to. So how we can change that, you know, when I covered, I saw this starting in presidential elections about 12 years ago, where the candidates made it very difficult to get any access to them. And now it's coming down to the state level, and it'll probably go to the local level, because it's just not in anyone's interest to have that free-flowing conversation that really is what democracy should be about.
I'd just like to add that from my perspective, it just seemed like there's this really toxic combination for a democracy where you have the press has been drained of power because it doesn't have money. It's kind of on its heels. It's got these really small staff. And I think a lot of reporters are, they're feeling that. And so they're not as aggressive as they might have been in days past. The candidates, the press has been demonized. And so the candidates don't want to have anything to do with the press. And that is, that also combines with this other thing in the digital age where candidates control their own Twitter accounts, their own Facebook accounts. They can always go on talk radio. So they've got this direct line and they don't feel like they need to talk to the press anymore. But it's, as you all know, it's a big difference between reading somebody's tweets and having someone like Mike Litwin talk to someone and ask them questions and push them. And you just don't see the candidates and the campaigns having anything to do with that. They don't feel any obligation to do that. It doesn't work for them. So it's a really toxic combination. I think it was really ramped up in this election.
And it's not just us whining, because at first I thought it was just us. I kind of got a complex about it. I stopped really covering politics about 8 years ago. So 8 years ago, I spent the summer largely with Bob Beaupre. And that was the time when I used to write political profiles for the Post, among other things. But I really loved writing political profiles. And it was just a given that they would give us access and that I would ride in the back of their car for a ridiculous amount of time and, you know, go travel around in August and September and write something before people started voting. And so we knew these people, right? And we had access. And there's a certain sense of, I think, entitlement that we had, not because, you know, we're so special, but because we are the watchdogs. We are the people who are supposed to tell you and readers and voters who these people are. And if you, the only really way to do that, we thought, and we kind of still believe this, is to spend time. And that means talking and watching and hearing how their message differs if they're in Rocky Ford, for example, or Aurora. And so this year, so then the Rocky went under, and I was a columnist at the point when the Rocky went under, and then Mike came over and sat next to me, and Mike started doing more. Mike does what he does, which is write politics, and I was kind of fried and a new mother and wanted to write about other things, so I wrote about social justice and criminal justice issues, and didn't really have anything to do with politics until kind of this year. And there's this event at the state fair every year for politicians, and I had been working on a profile of Bob Beaupre, another one, because I had done one 8 years earlier. And I had a lot of questions for him, including about some of his comments, like that he thinks people would line up like sheep for the government to put microchips in their bodies and stuff like that. And he knew that I was going to ask these questions because I kept contacting the campaign, and it's like this weird, surreal kind of, you're asking these questions and nobody would ever not return our phone calls before, and this was just call after call after call and email after email, because it's incumbent on us, it's our duty to do our due diligence and ask the questions, even if the door's getting slammed in our face. So we bend over backwards, I think, now, in a way that we never did before, like sending emails. This is all the questions I have, which is not something we would have done before. We just would have asked them the questions. Is this working? I think I keep turning it up. Hello? It's off. Oh, there. So, thank you. We're good. Anyway, so I saw him, and Bob Beaupre being Bob Beaupre, he's a big hugger, big hug. I hadn't seen him in 8 years, got such a good hug. And then I said, Bob, I have all these questions, like about the microchips and stuff. And he said, after having a nice little personal chat about our lives, just looked at me like so blankly and said, I'm not in control of my schedule. And I said, Bob, it's me, Bob. And he just said, I'm not in control of my schedule. And I think he said it a third time as well. And that pretty much is how it went this season. He wasn't in control of his schedule, which means get the hell away from me. And there kind of was no communication. And I don't want to just pick on Bob Beaupre. That happened with Cory Gardner. It also happened with Democratic candidates. It's not just a Republican thing. So what we've had to do, and we kind of went into it naively thinking like, oh, well, of course they'll answer our questions because we're us and they'll answer our questions. And we have to, we've had to learn how to communicate who these people are without that direct line of communication anymore. I mean, sometimes we get it. It's not like we don't get it at all. But if you're in, especially a campaign season, more often than not, you're really just you're not going to be riding in the back of Bob Beaupre's car, pretty much, especially after 8 years of him talking about microchips. And so, and those 8 years are important because the Tea Party happened, and then internet radio happened, and he started just saying all this stuff, right, that nobody at the Post or left anymore, or really at Channel 9, had the institutional memory to kind of know who he was 8 years ago, or to track how that may have changed the message over time. And so we kind of had to work around them as people, which is tough. And it's not just the media. They're not answering like the League of Women Voters questionnaire, so that's something that you would absolutely always do as a candidate. It just would be unheard of not to answer a questionnaire for the League of Women Voters if you're running for office. And the answer rate this year was about 50%. And And that's after the league like extended its deadlines and kind of begged them to please answer the questions. So it's not like they're just avoiding us. They're avoiding the more establishment media, and also they're not participating in debates as much, and they're not answering questions. So
It was so vigilant. Like, one of our ideas, like, when it became pretty clear how hard it would be to actually talk to the candidates directly, or even their campaigns, we said, well, what we'll do is we'll just follow them around on the stump, and we'll see how that goes. We can meet them in the park at in Longmont, and ask them a question. Let's do that. And but they wouldn't even make their schedules public. So you wouldn't know where they were going to be, who they were going to be speaking to. And when you did find out, it was a closed event and you couldn't get in, or you had to pay to get in, or they knew my face and so they weren't letting me in. It was really vigilant. And, what do you do with that? And one of the things you do is you say, well, let's look at their record. Let's write about their record. And that's a little... Those are much drier stories, and they don't really get at the person, who's Cory Gardner? Let's talk to him, let's see what he's like. So you have to just write about their record, but then it was really frustrating to watch them say, well, my record doesn't really matter. This is who I really am. So it's like, foiled again,
But Tessa, could I ask you, have you had access at the state legislature to legislators? I mean, are you getting kind of stonewalled in that way as well?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing. So, if you read the Colorado Independent, you probably know that last session I wasn't credentialed. Nobody from the Colorado Independent could get credentialed. It's actually it's a situation that's happening all over the country. If you read SCOTUS blog, for example, they can't get credentialed to cover the Supreme Court, even though they're sort of the go-to resource for coverage of that court. And I think it's a real challenge as the industry struggles. People don't want to pay for news. And so now there are a lot of questions about, well, how is it okay to fund journalism? Who should be allowed to be a journalist? And so no, the answer is that no. At the beginning, it was extremely, extremely difficult. Yeah, so credentialing means that you can go on the floor. So it's the kind of access that, I mean, it's the fourth estate, right? You're standing on the floor with them, you're proximate to them, you're sharing space and overhearing, and you come to know these people. You're on the floor as they make and debate bills. You can watch, on C-SPAN, or you can watch from the galleries, and that's great, and that's important, and that's what I did, and it works, in a lot of ways, and lots of senators would make time, or lots of, lawmakers would make time to talk, and I could get to people, but when you don't have, the idea behind journalism is to have a fly on the wall of power. And if you can't get in the kitchen, then something is lost. So we're still making that argument. But I think it's a tricky thing. It's much better at the state level. It definitely is. I mean, Susan was saying it wasn't a partisan thing necessarily, or uniformly, this election cycle, but definitely I was hounding. I covered Mark Udall a lot, and I would drive up to Estes Park to ask him a question about the NSA, because nobody could get me at any time to talk to him at all, unless I broke into a totally unrelated campaign event and was like, are you going to release the CIA drone portrait? I would just, so you always feel like you're blindsiding them because you're kind of jumping them at events. At the state level, it's better. People are, we have a citizen legislature, so there's a sort of a different sensibility in some cases around, yeah, there's a lot more accessibility, I would say, and people are friendly, and the session is long, so if you're around every day and you're always that one girl, after a while, people get into it. Yeah.
Well, Mike, what do you think the impact of all that has been on the elections? When so many people say, okay, Mark Udall lost that seat because of the message around women's issues, that it was just hammered away. I mean, do you think people weren't talking about his record around the NSA. They weren't talking about his record on anything except this particular message that was so tightly controlled, it seemed, by the advertising.
Well, a couple of things happened. One thing that happened is the percentage of money that comes from outside the campaigns and outside of the parties, and so how that money is spent. So you get they have an idea that the way for Mark Udall to win is to talk about women's reproductive rights, and that the election will be determined by how independent women in Jefferson County end up voting. So they hammered the message and hammered the message until it became, until it became ridiculed in a lot of corners for hammering it so much. But the way the system works, it's like steering a ship now, because all this money is coming in from the outside where many of the commercials are made, and so the strategy on the ground is sometimes different looking than it is from Washington or wherever the money is coming from. And so, and if you don't get the candidates themselves in a format where they're being asked questions about a lot of issues, then you're only getting these tightly focus grouped issues out there. Now the Democrats told me that the only issue that ever moved the needle was reproductive rights. Nothing else they talked about. Talked about the NSA, just flatlined. Nothing moved at all. And so there wasn't a way for them, I think because of how the money works, to get a strategy to say, well, look, this is all of a piece. And these things don't just work as one issue. They actually work when you see them as, holistically, and say, this works because this works, and the other guy doesn't see any of these things in the same way. So these are the issues that matter as a group. And I think it becomes much more difficult when you're running the same ads in Iowa and you're running the same ads in Kentucky, and you're saying, well, the ads in Kentucky and the ads in Iowa and the ads in Colorado should all be the same. It doesn't make any sense. They have coal mines in Kentucky. We have fracking in Colorado, and I don't know what the hell they have in Iowa. They have corn. They have corn. So, these are not, and they have castrated pigs, the way I read it. And so, I think that this stuff doesn't work together. And so did Mark Udall make a mistake in emphasizing one thing too much? Yeah, I think he did. Was it as easy to remedy as it seems? I think it isn't. And I think that at the end, when they saw that they needed to move the conversation, it was very difficult to do it because of the way our big money system works. I mean, if you want to look at where the rot is, it's not just the corruption that big money inevitably brings with it. It's the drowning out of even the candidates' voices somehow get drowned out by the big money. And it's not just on one side. There was basically an equal amount of money raised from both sides, and so to answer your question, when people ask me what happened in this election, and I would say a lot of things happened, and a lot of them not even intentionally.
What do you think is just going to be more of the same in 2016? I mean, given the money that was spent in this a midterm election, what are we going to see in a pretty major
well,
presidential
here's what's going to
election
happen.
year?
There's going to be, it's going to be a presidential election. So the presidential campaign will control its own message. So the question is, how does everybody else fit into that? And so what are the lessons of 2014? If you remember, in 2012, Republicans had their disastrous election. There was this famous autopsy written by the Republican National Committee in which it said all the things they needed to do to rescue the party. They did basically none of those things and had a tremendous success 2 years later. So having done none of those things and having a success, I believe the Democratic Party will look at the results similarly and say we need to change some things, and they'll say, yeah, you know, we really have a much better thing demographically looking for us in 2016. We'll get more voters. We'll probably win in 2016. And the whole idea of how issues get discussed won't improve at all.
We've sounded really depressing, and so
You're not depressed, you're not paying attention.
yeah. There are a couple things to know. Whereas turnout was pretty historically low nationally in this midterm, Colorado did much better, and that is due in part to the fact that we have really terrific new voting laws that if you noticed, if you maybe went to bed when John Hickenlooper was losing and you woke up maybe and John Hickenlooper was winning, that was because votes were being tallied in some urban areas, and a lot of those voters had actually registered the day of the election, which is something that can happen under our new laws. And so I think that's really, really good news, number one, and I think that will come into play in 2016 for sure. And you know, if we were targeted this year, we're going to definitely be targeted next year. And if we had all the staff, this is our full-time staff, by the way, so smoke and mirrors, right? We do have freelancers that we work with, but we are a nonprofit, and if we had our, like all the money in the world, we'd put someone right on the presidential race right now, right? Or on 2016 right now. The other thing is that there's just an enormous get out the vote effort in Colorado because we were targeted, and so it worked. That our turnout was better than others. One thing to kind of answer your question, there's been a lot written in the last even like 24 or 48 hours about the 99% and the 1% when the 99% is going to get really pissed off and rise up, and about just basic economic inequality in this country. And when I read that, I always kind of, because we look through things through our prism, which is we ask questions and we expect answers, and there's an injustice in not getting answers. I mean, if you watch the debates and you watched Cory Gardner sit there with Eli Stokols or sit there with Channel 9 and not, like in an incredibly artful way, not answer the question about the slippage, and I use that word that very diplomatically, between his position on personhood federally and his position on personhood statewide. If you're not taking offense at that, if you don't feel insulted by that there's a certain level of contempt there when you have a candidate who's running to represent our state, who's looking this reporter in the eye and over again aggressively not answering his question, and you're not pissed about that. I kind of put that in the same column as like the 99%. I mean, I think people need to rise up in many ways in this country, and one of them is to expect their elected officials to answer their questions. And I think that has to come not just from us whining, but from any ideas you have about that. And that could mean op-ed pieces, it could mean blogs, it could mean literally confronting your elected officials. doing everything you can to just make sure that this trope that we're talking about, this pattern of like militant not answering questions stops, because it's contemptuous as hell and it's terrible for our democracy.
Well, given all of that and given the lack of access that you've just really been talking about in this election cycle, where are people supposed to go for information? I mean, where are voters supposed to go to actually get information on either voting records, positions, you know?
Colorado Independent, of course. That was a setup, softball question. There's been for many years this argument about horse race coverage versus issues coverage, and as we've become, as the sort of red-blue divide has become more and more pronounced, the issues coverage has become, I think, sort of less and less an issue, in that we sort of know where every Republican stands on most issues, and we sort of know where most Democrats stand on most issues. And if you're voting, if you're an issues voter and your issues tend to go liberal, then 99%, to use a coin of phrase, are on the left are going to be, Democrats are going to be more left, and Republicans will be more right. I saw this, of course, is at the national level. At the local level, those things are not nearly as, a lot of local elections aren't even partisan, and they're not nearly as clear cut, and you have more and more, with more and more difficulty, I think, that you find independent answers to questions like that, because, as I was saying before, the newspapers don't have the resources to cover these races in the way that they did. I want to add to what Susan said. I think that I think we shouldn't get hung up on simply whether politicians are responsive to questions so much as how the issues are determined. And the fact of issues being determined by money is really at the heart of this. And it's not so much that that politicians don't want to talk to you, as they don't want to get in the way of the message that people are spending millions and millions of dollars of crafting. So the message, of course, is usually a non-message. It's a piece of a small message that is focus group to bring X voters into the fray. I mean, I saw this in, I think, first really noticed in the 2000 presidential election, when a lot of people will look and say that Al Gore lost, if he actually lost, that he lost on gun control, and how Democrats sort of gave up on gun control until very recently, with some sad effect. But they gave up on gun control because they were worried about Western Pennsylvania and Upper Peninsula in Michigan. And those two places, and those small percentage of voters who might shift two close states from one party to the other, settled a hugely important issue, became an issue that was centered on just these tiny percentage of voters in two states. And that's the way that politics have gotten worse and worse as they've gotten, everyone's supposed to be amazed at all these things that the computers do now, and how they give us what this voter is going to do in this zip code, in this street, in this house, and how you know, the upstairs in this house will vote one way if you press this issue, and the downstairs in this house will press another way, and if the kitchen lights are on, they'll vote another way, and if the oven's turned off, they'll vote another way, and all of this means this is not impressive at all. What it just means is it works against actual issues being discussed, and I think when we're talking about politicians not talking, it's all of a piece.
Well,
Is that depressing enough?
we will be opening up the floor for questions, but I do want to ask you what you're covering right now, but also touch on this issue of how journalism is being funded and really the impact then, because Susan, I mean, you're an investigative reporter, you know, are used to diving into issues and looking at stuff. Now, because of the nature of what you're doing at the Colorado Independent, I mean, how much time do you have to spend on just raising funds to actually be able to do the journalism that you want to do?
An obscene amount of time. I would be writing every day and so much more if it weren't for the fact that we need to keep ourselves afloat. And, you know, even though we've kind of been around since 2006, we really look at ourselves as a startup. We feel like we were born again last year, and we've started this movement, and that movement requires a lot more of us. And there are plenty of people who are very talented. I mean, Mike gave you the numbers on how many people left journalism, and that has been an incredibly sad thing. And when I'm trying to make this less depressing, so I'll just tell you something kind of fun and happy, which was no matter how you feel about election night and how it went, in our little shop, we hired 16-ish people, 17 people, as stringers and people to be at different places and cover different races and all the ballot issues and do video and take photographs and edit video and edit stuff. And we felt like there's a tradition in newsrooms, you order pizza even if nobody really wants the pizza and it's greasy and cold. You do it on election night, and it's an incredibly depressing thing for a journalist not to have an election to cover on election night. I had one of those elections, and it was just awful, and everybody feels that way. We just feel so without a purpose. So we were lucky enough to join together with, we put a ton of resources into it and hired some young people and some serious veterans, and there was just it was like a religious experience a little bit, not just because we were like up so late and we were delirious, and at one point the three of us were just like on the floor laughing our butts off because we were so tired and trying to edit the copy and like figure out the numbers, and we were so exhausted. But the fact that we got to do it and were able to do it was just a great joy for us. And so what we'd like to do is bring some of those fabulous people who were with us on a much more full-time basis. And what that means is we have big funders. We're starting to get some medium funders. But what we really are excited about is something is individual funders, and something that really, really cool and exciting and positive that happened is that do you know Mike Keefe? Yes, the Pulitzer-winning cartoonist who we had the pleasure of working with at the Post for years and years. He was there for, I think, 36 years, won a Pulitzer in 2011, and also left the Post in 2011, and didn't have anywhere to cartoon in Colorado. And there's this thing called crowdfunding you might know about, and we journalists like suck at finances, and we don't know things about like business plans and development, and we don't know about crowdfunding, right? And so we crowdfunded for Mike Keefe, and that is like this expression, this small d democratic expression of support for journalism in an era when people, I mean, a large reason why the Rocky went under and newspapers are doing so poorly is they made the fatal mistake of giving their content away online when everything went online. And so people were so used to getting content for free that the notion of paying for it, just they didn't, because they didn't have to, right? And so now you're either going to get, well, now there are paywalls at papers, or you'll just get very limited news for free, or you could do things like, you know, we had people giving $5 to Mike Keefe in this crowdfunding thing, and we had this, it was a 20-day window, and it was like a total drama, and for journalists to stand up and ask for money, we're just so bad at it. We can ask questions, we can speak to governors and presidents, we can put ourselves in all sorts of uncomfortable situations, but asking for money is quite humiliating, actually, and I feel humiliated every day on a daily basis doing it. And it wasn't easy for Mike to put himself out there and say, please fund what I do, because what he does is enormously important. And there's this weird thing about crowdfunding. It's like the Jerry Lewis telethon that nobody really like gives it until the last minute because everybody wants to be a hero. So we had 20 days of just like super stressy, this isn't gonna happen. And then we just watch this needle, you know, it was like the last hour or something, and he made it. And that was a very beautiful thing. And then so we have Mike Keefe running because the people paid for him, and we paid for him to run with us once a week. And then something else kind of weird happened, which is Mike Keefe cartoons for a syndicate that the Denver Post runs every Sunday. So the Denver Post, he no longer worked at the Post, but they were running his cartoons, and people very much enjoy Mike Keefe's cartoons. I know some people who only get the Post because of Mike Keefe's cartoons. And because he started cartooning for us and the crowdfunding was a success, they said to him, you know what, we're not running your stuff anymore. So that second cartoon that he drew every week, we're now getting. So yeah, it's a sick and sad story, and the thought of them actually saying that to his face, a Pulitzer winner, for no other reason than, well, I won't surmise what the reasons were, because that would be raunchy, but the point is that we now get 2-for-1 Mike Keefe, and we love what he does, and there's nothing kind of more, there's no really greater honor for us as journalists than to write a story and have Mike cartoon about it. It's cool.
Add to that long answer to your question, Maeve, about how to fund journalism these days. Just the Colorado Independent, we have large donors, small donors, grants, crowdfunding, all these different streams. You have to be so creative now. But it also shows how complicated it is to fund journalism and why credentialing models are out of step. I mean, the thing at the Capitol is if you're not getting your money from advertising, then you basically can't get a credential. Well, I mean, what advertising? Like that, we'll take a little bit of advertising money too, but it, you know, the model is changing every week, every month, and that's really complicated, and it's hard for the industry to even get their mind around anymore about, you know, where the firewall is, where bias comes in, how all these questions are relevant anymore. They're still relevant, but how do you answer them properly? So that's a big deal, and it's a strange thing in America. You know, what is America really good at? That's making money on products, you know? So more people read the news than ever before. More people read everything online than ever before. And it's just really hard to get paid to do it, which is really ironic. And you're also asking about like where people get their information. But when we covered we took a chance and we spent money for these stringers, and we really covered the election as intensely as we could the last couple days of the election. And our traffic went way up. People were, you know, it was like I don't know, quadrupled our usual numbers, hundreds of thousands of people reading the website. And we just felt like the little engine that could, and what we could do with 4 more bodies was just amazing, you know, full time. So if anybody has good ideas about how to make money in this business, you should do it.
Right. And when Mike said he writes for pretty much every paper in the state, so what that means is these for-profit papers in the state, which are the same papers that don't want to give us credentials to the State House, okay, are taking our content because we have a policy of steal our stuff, just give us credit. They're taking our content, Mike's work, and some of our news stories, and running it for free. Well, we feel like the stories are important, and we want the stories to get out. We sometimes kind of just grin and bear it when we get plagiarized, which happens more and more. We're going to keep giving our stuff away for free because we're in the middle of applying for a 501c3, and our purpose as a nonprofit is to be educational, so we're going to keep doing that, and hopefully we'll grow, and we'll figure out some funding models that we've started working on, and some new ones that have yet to be invented, that somehow balances that, because does that feel out of balance to you? Kind of feels out of balance to us a little bit. We're happy to be here and we're happy to do it, but it's a little weird that all these for-profit sites are, I don't know, it's kind of like raised by wolves, like, you know. I'll stop though. Okay, yeah.
Well, I'd like to let folks ask questions, open it up. Does anybody have a question? We have a microphone here. Henry will pass along.
Well, let's go we'll go from the front to the back. Will the bleacher bums come on down? Okay, so we have, and you could say your name if you like.
I'm wondering sort of about more historical background about losing access. How did you gain access before? Did it come out of the Watergate era? Was it because of revealing law breaking by politicians that they were forced to give access, and now they don't have to reveal that even? So it's kind of like even worse, catch-22.
I'm the only one old enough to answer the question. It's more complicated than that. I think there was a time when, if you go back to the beginnings of the modern newspaper, which would be in the middle of the 19th century, that most of the newspapers were clearly with one party or another. They'd be called the Democrat, or they'd be called the Republican, or the Whig, or something. And so there would be, you would be that party's guy, basically. So that changed around in the early part of the 20th century. And but at the same time, it didn't change sort of the relationship where I think in most cases, the people who covered the people they were writing about were very close and palsy with those people, and I think that didn't really change until sometime after World War II, and it really, newspapers really came into their prime, I would think, in the 60s, and that came with a great deal of money and with the nationalization, the ease with which you could cover stories throughout the world, and so the newspapers became more and more professional, which as they covered the issues more professionally, there started to become a division. So I would say that the newspapers holding people accountable was not a way to get more access. In fact, it diminished your access. And for a lot of people covering stuff, it becomes a very complicated thing. So if you're covering, say, the governor, it's your job to cover the governor. If you are the outlier, one guy who asks all the tough questions and writes all the tough stories, then you tend to get shut out. And the person who's closer and writing nicer stories is tending to get the scoops. And so there's a balance there in coverage. And today the issue, Tessa was talking about working at the legislature, and people who are in the legislature, they have issues they want to be discussed that aren't being discussed, and the media is a way to help get those issues discussed, and it's a completely different role than it is in say covering national politics, where the print media particularly has a much less of a role individually to play and sort of leverage to use in getting stories out. That's sort of a roundabout answer to your question, but it's not as easy as forcing candidates to or forcing officials to respond. I mean, Watergate, when John Mitchell was screaming about Katharine Graham, that wasn't helping the Washington Post get these stories. They were getting them in quite a different way.
There's also a new kind of access that I used to cover the military, and that's a very hard thing to cover because you kind of don't have any access. I used to cover Area 51, which had 17 public information people dealing with a base that didn't officially exist, right? So nobody is more disgusted by corruption and problems in the military than military members themselves, right? And what I've noticed, I came here to cover the city, and this kind of, the Denver Post had at that time 2 to 3 people covering City Hall, and so there was like the good cop and the bad. I was the bad cop. I'm always the bad cop, and sometimes there was a medium cop. But and I didn't necessarily have a ton of access to Wellington Webb when I covered him, but the people who worked in the city, who probably were the most, who wanted certain stories out there maybe more than anybody else, would talk to me, right? And now that there's nobody covering City Hall, and let's be clear, there's pretty much nobody covering City Hall, and there's just been this spate of excessive force cases that just doesn't stop in the Denver Sheriff's Department. It used to kind of be that the sheriff's people in the Sheriff's Department they didn't really like me so much because I was revealing things about their department that made them kind of look bad. But they still may not like me so much, but now that nobody's watching and nobody's like, these stories aren't getting out, I'm the only person, or we're the only people. What I'm trying to say is I'm getting a lot more calls, And I've heard people say about newspapers, I subscribed to the newspaper not necessarily because I read it, but because it made me feel good that I knew somebody was watching City Hall, right? And I think, again, really nobody's really watching City Hall. I mean, when we write something about the Sheriff's Department, it kind of spurs other coverage, which is good, and that's kind of part of that answer of, giving our stuff away for free, that we give our stuff away for free, and then also if we write something big enough, it gets copied or other people follow it in the spirit of competition. But there was a man, I don't know if you read this story, this happened this week at the VA in Grand Junction, who was a social worker and was watching one of his clients be really badly treated, and that's an understatement, by the VA. And so he corroborated this man's complaint and then resigned as a kind of statement of his disgust for the VA. So he's a whistleblower, right? And it is increasingly rare in this economy that people would quit their jobs over, out of principle, right? But there are still those people who either do that. He's kind of exceptional. He quit his job. But people who take great risks, people take great risks in talking to us, and they're very sophisticated about how they communicate with me, because like in the Denver Sheriff's Department, there are people working, spending a lot of their time trying to figure out who's talking to us, right? Not necessarily addressing the problem of like, stop beating the hell out of your inmates, but who's leaking stuff to the Colorado Independent. So there are really great acts of bravery by our sources, and I think the more the media shrinks, in some ways there's maybe hope for more of that kind of information flow.
Going front to back, we have another question.
My name's Ken Benetti. I'm a local resident. Try to be active once in a while. My question is, what you've described the way media has been progressing up to this point. What's your sense of the trend line or the future of media, independent media, and also coverage of election coverage going forward from here?
I mean, it's just anecdotal, but I think that, and instinctive, but I feel like it sounds crazy to say, but I think we're sort of going through a golden age of independent media in some way. There's a lot of access. There's a lot of access points where you can get your independent journalism read, or at least you can get it out there. It's harder to get it read. The startup costs are really low, but investigative journalism is really hard to fund. That's really labor intensive, and to do it well takes a lot of time and a lot of women hours. So, I mean, independent media is because the mainstream media is struggling. I think there's an opportunity for independent media, but again, it comes down to how to really fund something that's deeper and goes further, and that's really difficult. I don't know. I mean, we're in a golden age of opportunity. What we do with that is a big question. A lot of people in the independent media circles are talking, or they were talking for years about, public funding, but in the States, I don't think that will really ever happen, and at least not on a scale that makes it, that can compete with the media system that has just retired, that has just passed or is passing. I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go.
I mean, one thing I think that we are seeing is, and I think people made this prediction around like globalism, like what we'll get is specialization. So some of the most successful online reporting outfits are like shockingly niche, so they only report about immigration, they only report about fracking, or they only report about urban design. And it turns out that if you stay really tiny like that and really focused, then sometimes you can get public and reader funding because you're kind of getting your top people who care about that the most will invest in it. And that does seem to be working. And so maybe what we'll see is not so much like a total collapse of journalism, but a serious dispersion of it, and sort of more independent kind of, we largely cover politics, we do other things, but I think that there's a way in which, sort of what used to be sections, what used to be one-stop information shopping is now lots of much smaller, leaner outfits, and I think that can work.
Yeah, I mean, all of the new research shows that people get their stories, basically, it comes to them. They don't go to one outlet anymore. They get it through people sending them links, through their mobile phones, that kind of stuff. And so it seems more like this kind of thing, like if you're just writing about environmental issues, or if you're just writing about gay rights issues or civil rights or criminal justice, those stories, people are aggregating them themselves, or sites like Facebook suddenly becomes your sort of newspaper, where depending on what your friends and relatives are reading and your crazy uncle, that's, they're kind of making these editorial decisions for you, for better or worse.
Let's have some more questions. We have a gentleman in the back, and then we'll come to Lynn over here.
Hi, my name is Frank Sturgill. I'm in process of writing some lawsuits both against the city of Denver and the state of Colorado for the city with the contractor's license, which is the worst in the country, and the architect's license for the state in Dora. What I've uncovered is I've actually now given out 130 notices of claim in the state suit, and it's perjury, racketeering. Span from degree to licensure has grown from 3 years in 1983 to an average of 11 today. The span from degree to licensure in architecture has grown from 3 years in 1983 to an average of 11 today, and that was done by a study called Concerning Licensure. Our state law says no more than 3 years practical experience can be demanded by the board, and now they're at 11 years. They're doing they're lying on the exams. People that are passing exams, and they're lying on them. I've had conversations with Hickenlooper, and he has told me, and I've asked him, what will you follow and enforce the law? And he said that would take an enormous effort. So what do I have to do to get my story out to you?
Well, you should just call us, email us. We're happy to talk to you. I actually got a call yesterday about something else, DORA related. DORA is the Department of Regulatory Affairs. So that's like a hornet's nest of uncovered. It's a mother lode of news.
It's
and
huge.
Now that we're
Barbara Kelly's, she has perjury in the first degree in the Sunset Review. She said that she's following and enforcing the law, and I have proof she's not.
Well, we'd love to hear your story. I do think that DORA, in many, I don't know how many sectors DORA oversees, but it's a ton.
Yeah.
And this call was having to do with medical, the people who, when a doctor, let's say, gets a DUI, and the people who decide whether the doctor should keep the doctor's license are the same people who have the contract to take the urine analysis, and there's a conflict, there's a perceived conflict there that somebody needs to look into, and we do get a lot of calls about DORA, so we're happy to hear your story. I mean, again, I can't promise that we'll jump on it. Like, you're looking at the Colorado Independent, and we have a pile of stories and investigative projects that we have put off because of the election. So it's not like we have the liberty to jump on every investigative project that comes our way, but we're happy to hear what you have to say. and it sounds like you've done a ton of work. So
I have. It's been a couple years so far.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, Lynn, we're running short on time, so let's have a couple of quick questions from the rest of the panel.
I was just thinking of two things. One, what if, since there's so much being spent on both sides and it's about equivalent, what if we just quit spending anything on either side? Since it's about the same. And then the other thing I forgot.
Well, the, all right, so I think we have a question. All right, so I think the name of this topic is called the media election complex. And so, Mike, I think you'd be a good one to respond.
Yeah,
Media election
it'd be a great thing, but you can't force people not to spend money. So, and the laws they've all been tossed out. So, yeah.
You know, and if there was a way that I could be if there's a way that, for example, we said there was a proposition put forth that if there was 70% of the people voted, then I might vote. But as it is, if less and less people are voting, and we're still getting laws passed and ballot measures passed with a very low percentage of the population that's actually voting for these things, it just makes me not want to vote.
Again, when I would call that voter suppression. Who benefits from voter suppression if we keep the turnout low? Is that part of the complex that you were talking about?
Well, it's funny. I mean, because there's a conventional wisdom that says if voter turnout is high, that the Democrats win, and if it's lower, then the Republicans win. But we had very high turnout, and the Republicans won the Senate seat anyway. So and won the state Senate. So it's actually Republicans got a bunch of their low turnout voters to vote this time out. So it's not clear, but you know, we have actually in Colorado, we have a pretty high voter turnout as opposed to most states. Before we passed the laws which liberalize voting, and I assume that in 2016 you'll see a very high percentage voting in Colorado. But I think, you know, I think the greater question that you're talking about, part of the real failure of a two-party system in America as opposed to multi-party systems that a lot of other democracies have, is that it's very difficult for people whose views are not necessarily aligned with minority parties to get their views heard. And that's a problem that we've faced. That's a problem we've faced in this country for a long time.
So here we go.
Just a recommendation. I recently saw the film by Glenn Greenwald called Citizen 4, and this film, that Citizen 4 is a code name for the person who first was a witness for so it's Snowden, and it's an excellent film. It's demanding.
What's the name of that film? Citizen 4?
Citizen 4.
And where could we see it?
Well, it was a century.
All right.
I'm
Well,
not sure if it's still there or not.
Well, Henry, just before we finish up, I would like to just hear what stories you are working on now, given the midterm elections are wrapped up. I know there's still a lot of work being done. Do you want to just quickly mention some of the stories that you're either working on that people can read right now or soon?
Right, I don't want to
Don't give it away.
generally speaking. I'm working on a longer feature right now about it's an immigration story. It's about a girl named Rose who was living orphaned as a 12-year-old in a Zambian refugee camp and just got to the U.S. kind of right as the big uptick in the Ebola stuff was happening, and so it's sort of looking at it's a kind of from tracking this one story, this one family, this one girl, looking at the question of immigration reform and where we stand. So that should be interesting.
I've got about 10 fracking stories lined up on my desk. So tune in. Much more to come on that.
And they're really good. Really good. I have a lot of grants to write, and I guess in my spare time, I have a lot of video. I have something like 23 or 24 Freedom of Information requests into the city and county of Denver that I've been stonewalled on, having to do with things going on in the police department and the sheriff's department. So I need to nudge them on that and maybe get a lawyer involved because we're way past the time when they should have handed that stuff over. I also have a story out of the Supermax at Florence, the federal Supermax at Florence. One of the inmates there has been writing about that person's experience for about a year, and I just got the manuscript. There's no way for us to communicate or visit or speak to those people on the phone, so that's its own kind of interesting kind of reporting on somebody who's in solitary confinement who I can't hear the voice of or meet or shake the hand of, but without getting into too much specifics here, I think that's a really important story that needs to be told. So that's kind of going to be what I'm doing when I'm not writing grants.
So as you can see, we're too small, and we hire freelancers as we can to work on stories where we overload ourselves with stories. There are so many good and important stories out there to do, and we think in terms of impact, what stories we can do that will make a difference, and what stories that we can do that will move us forward so that we can move issues forward. And it's we face ourselves with a lot of complicated decisions as to how much time to spend to doing what, because we are so understaffed. But what Susan is trying to do, she's writing grants, we want to get more money so we can have more people hired, so we can do more and better stories. Spending time on stories is how you make stories better, and spending resources is how you make stories better. And we have huge ambitions, and we have a small staff, so those things tend to collide, and so we're trying to solve them by having even more ideas, but getting more people to do them.
Well, on that note, I think we want to adjourn soon. Do you want to have a final thought, Maeve?
Well, I think, as we've heard tonight, this is something that absolutely has to be supported. And as an independent media outlet ourselves, KGNU, we're delighted to be neighbours physically in the Denver office, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you some of these stories. And I know, as I said, they've been getting national, international attention on democracy now. I know you're probably going to be on again. Some of these stories sound amazing. So if you haven't checked out the website, you've got to absolutely go to coloradoindependent.com and stay tuned. Yeah. And thank you, Henry, for
No, it's
hosting
not
us all.
.org. It's, I've tried
.com,
that
isn't it?
.org. It's .com.
.com.
So, anyway, I found to thank you, everybody. The panel, we're going to be... and another thank you to Maeve. So you can understand here how important independent, accountability journalism is. And that's what these guys and gals are practicing. It's really an important part of our lives that is rare, increasingly rare. But we're going to fund this. It's going to go forward. This is a model, a national model that is right on our lap. And KGNU is part of this process, too. So thank you, everybody. And let's have some refreshments now.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, thank you.